You come from a long line of animals that got eaten, not hunted in the noble cinematic sense. Eaten, pulled off riverbanks, cracked open in caves, carried into treetops by birds and dropped as bone chips into holes in the ground, where we dug them out 2 million years later and gave them catalogue numbers. For almost the entire run of our family tree, the thing standing where you're standing right now was not the most dangerous animal in the neighbourhood. It was food that happened to walk upright. There's a cave in northern China where the skulls of our relatives piled up by the dozen, and it took the better part of 80 years to work out who had been stacking them there. We spent most of that time blaming the wrong species. I'll get to that cave, because what actually lived in it is the single best argument for why the world before us was a place you would not have lasted in. Start with the obvious thing nobody says out loud. This planet is about 4.5 billion years old, and for all but the last thin sliver of that, it had no interest in keeping anything like you alive. The air alone would have killed you for most of it. For roughly the first 2 billion years, there was almost no free oxygen down here. Then, somewhere around 2.4 billion years ago, cyanobacteria in the shallow seas started pumping out oxygen as a waste product, and it built up in the air. Life invented the gas you're breathing right now, and for most of what was already living down here, that gas was poison. The leading interpretation is that it also stripped methane out of the atmosphere and dropped the planet into an ice age so severe that glaciers may have run all the way to the equator. That's the warm-up act. The planet went on to nearly empty itself 5 separate times. The worst one hit about 252 million years ago at the end of the Permian, when the Siberian traps opened up and poured out enough lava to bury the lower 48 states more than a mile deep. Ocean chemistry collapsed. Somewhere between 80 and 90% of species in the sea were erased, and tropical sea surface temperatures climbed to around 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot tub water, from horizon to horizon, for thousands of years. Then 66 million years ago, a rock somewhere between 6 and 9 miles across came in over the Yucatan at about 45,000 miles per hour, and closed the book on the dinosaurs that weren't birds. None of that was aimed at us. Every one of those catastrophes happened to a planet that had never produced a primate and had no plans to. When our line finally showed up, it walked into a system already running at that setting, and the system did not adjust. So walk into it. East Africa, about 3 million years ago, at the edge of the lake we now call Turkana in northern Kenya. Stand there for a second and take inventory. It's around 100 degrees, and the light comes off the water flat and white, the way it does off a windshield in a July parking lot. The ground is churned mud, printed over with the tracks of everything that came down before you. There's noise from the reeds that stops when you move and starts again when you don't. And the water in front of you is the only reason anything within 20 miles is still alive, which means every animal in the region has to make the same trip you're making, on the same schedule, to the same 12 feet of shoreline. You need to drink. Everything needs to drink. And the water is where the problem lives. In 2012, paleontologists Christopher Brochu and Glenn Storrs described a crocodile from that lake basin they named Crocodylus thorbjarnarsoni, pronounced Crocodylus thorbjarnarsoni. It reached something like 25 feet, possibly more, which makes it arguably the largest true crocodile ever found. The best skull in the collection took 4 grown men to lift. Our ancestors in that basin were small, roughly 4 feet tall, walking down to the shoreline every single day of their lives with no way to see what was 6 inches under the surface. There's a related species from Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania that got named Crocodylus anthropophagus, pronounced Anthropophagus. The second word is Greek. It means human eater. It was named that because hominin bones from the same deposits carry its bite marks. Getting out of the water didn't help. In 2022, a team led by Camille Groé described a new species from the Omo Valley in Ethiopia, and the animal turned out to be an otter that weighed about 440 pounds. Lion-sized. Isotopes in its teeth suggest it wasn't fishing like modern otters do, it was hunting on land. That thing shared a floodplain with Australopithecines, pronounced Australopithecines, the small upright apes we call our ancestors, and it outweighed them by roughly 6 to 1. There were cats down there too, Dinophilis, pronounced Dinophilis, a heavy short-limbed ambush killer built for close work in thick cover, Meganterion, pronounced Meganterion, a dirk-toothed cat with daggers in its upper jaw. Some researchers have argued Dinophilis specialised in hominins. That's a hypothesis, not a finding, and it's been pushed back on hard. What isn't in dispute is that a 200-pound ambush cat in dense brush is a solved problem for a 5-foot ape with no claws. And then there's the one that should genuinely bother you. In 1924, an anatomist named Raymond Dart got a crate of limestone from a quarry near the town of Taung in South Africa. Inside was the face and brain cast of a child, a young Australopithecus africanus, and it became one of the most famous fossils in the world. For decades, everyone assumed a big cat had killed it. Then in the mid-1990s, Lee Berger and Ron Clark noticed the whole bone assemblage at that site looked like something a bird would leave behind. Berger later matched damage on the skull to the marks that African crowned eagles leave on monkeys they've killed. Puncture marks and ragged incisions in the base of the eye sockets, made when a bird hooks its talons in and takes the eyes. An eagle killed one of our ancestors and carried it off. Not everyone accepts the interpretation, and the authors themselves say other agents can't be fully ruled out. But the damage matches, and the rest of the bone bed matches, and the reasonable reading is that a bird ate a member of our family. That's what the top of the food chain looked like for us for 3 million years. It looked like nothing. We weren't at the top. We weren't even the most interesting thing in the middle. Which brings me back to that cave in northern China. The site is called Zhoukoudian, pronounced Zhoukoudian, on a hill outside Beijing that locals had been calling Dragon Bone Hill for generations. Excavations there in the 1920s and 1930s pulled out an extraordinary haul of Homo erectus remains, the species we call Peking man, and the assemblage was strange. It was mostly skull fragments, very few limb bones, lots of damage. Franz Weidenreich, the anatomist who studied them, and others after him, read that pattern as cannibalism, our ancestors killing and eating each other in the dark. That interpretation sat in textbooks for the better part of a century, and it shaped how a lot of people pictured early humans: violent, desperate, feeding on their own. Then in the early 2000s, Noel Boaz, Russell Siochon and their colleagues went back through the damage patterns and pointed at a different resident of that cave, Pachyrhocutta brevirostris, pronounced Pachyrhocutta, the giant short-faced hyena, the largest hyena that ever lived, averaging around 240 pounds with big individuals pushing past 300, standing about 3 feet at the shoulder on short, massively built legs with premolars that went through bone the way a bolt cutter goes through a padlock. The scoring on those skulls, the punctures, the way the bones were broken and what was missing, all of it pointed at a den, a place where a large carnivore brought food home and worked on it. The interpretation is still argued over, and people did occupy that cave at times. Look at the shape of the mistake, though. For 80 years we assumed the most frightening thing in that cave was us, because we couldn't picture being anything else. We were wrong by an entire species, and the pressure showed up in our genes. In 2023, a team led by Wang Jiehu published a study in Science using a new method that reads population size backward out of the DNA of living people. They analysed more than 3,000 modern genomes, and the model came back with something ugly sitting in our deep past. Somewhere between 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, the ancestral human breeding population appears to have collapsed to roughly 1,280 individuals. Not 1,280 in one valley. That's the estimate for the whole lineage, and it stayed down there for something like 117,000 years. For comparison, that's fewer breeding adults than you'd find in a single high school in Ohio, holding the entire future of our species for a stretch of time close to 500 times longer than the United States has existed. The finding is contested, and several population geneticists have argued the method overstates how close to the edge things really got. But it lines up with a genuine gap in the African and Eurasian fossil record from that exact window, and nobody has explained that gap better. Now pull back from one hill in China and look at the rest of the continent, because Asia in that era had something walking around that reads like folklore. Gigantopithecus blacki, pronounced Gigantopithecus, the largest primate that has ever existed, standing perhaps 10 feet tall, weighing somewhere between 440 and 60 pounds, an ape roughly 3 times the mass of a big male gorilla, moving through the karst forests of southern China. We know it almost entirely from teeth, about 2,000 of them, plus 4 jaw bones. That's the whole record of the biggest ape in the history of the planet. A study published in Nature in 2024 dated its extinction window to between 295,000 and 215,000 years ago, using nearly a dozen caves and 6 separate dating methods. Its forest turned seasonal, its food supply narrowed, and it didn't adapt fast enough, which means the largest ape ever to exist was still alive, in China, at the same moment the earliest members of our own species were walking around North Africa. The oldest Homo sapiens fossils we have come from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, pronounced Jebel Irhoud, at roughly 300,000 years old. For a stretch there, both species were on the same planet at the same time. Push north into Ice Age Europe and Siberia and the roster gets worse. Cave lions bigger than any lion alive today. Cave bears, Elasmotherium, pronounced Elasmotherium, a rhino heavier than a loaded F-150, with a skull dome that almost certainly carried one enormous horn. It hung on until roughly 39,000 years ago, and it's the animal most often floated as the seed of the unicorn legend. And Homotherium, pronounced Homotherium, the scimitar-toothed cat, around 400 pounds, long in the front legs, short in the back, built to run prey down in open country rather than ambush it. Everyone assumed Homotherium had vanished from Europe around 300,000 years ago. Then a trawler dragged a jawbone out of the North Sea, and radiocarbon put it at about 28,000 years, over 200,000 years younger than anything else on the continent. Ancient DNA later confirmed it. And in 2024, researchers described a mummified Homotherium cub pulled from Siberian permafrost, frozen for roughly 35,000 years, with its fur, its whiskers, its paw pads, and its dark coat still on it. We have a saber-toothed cat's face. Not a cast, not a reconstruction. Its actual face. There's a wrinkle in the phrase, before humans, and it's worth stopping on. For most of the planet, that phrase describes a place rather than a moment in time. North America had never seen a human being. Not one. For tens of millions of years, the continent ran its own experiment, and by the last ice age it had assembled a lineup that makes modern America look like a petting zoo. Arctodus simus, pronounced Arctodus simus, the short-faced bear, stood something like 11 or 12 feet tall when it reared up and may have weighed close to a ton. Its behaviour is genuinely debated, and the old picture of a specialised long-legged hunter has been challenged by researchers who read it as a big opportunistic omnivore. Either version is standing eye level with a second-story window. Smilodon fatalis, pronounced SMY Ludon, ran 600 to 900 pounds, heavier and far stockier than an African lion, with forelimbs like a powerlifter and 7-inch canines it used to open throats. Panthera atrox, pronounced Panthera atrox, the American lion, may have hit 800 pounds, heavier than any lion alive today. Megatherium, pronounced Meg-Ertherium, the giant ground sloth, weighed up to 4 tons and stood 12 feet when it reached up into a tree with claws to match. And the dire wolves. Genomic work published in Nature in 2021 established that they weren't wolves at all in any close sense. Their lineage split from the ancestors of grey wolves close to 6 million years ago, and there's no sign the two ever interbred. They were a separate New World predator that had converged on the same shape. An animal that looks like your dog's cousin, and isn't related in any way that matters. Put yourself on that ground. You're coming south out of the ice with a group of maybe 30 people, carrying fire, stone points, and everything you own. It's cold enough that your breath hangs. The country in front of you looks like Wyoming with the volume turned up. Open grassland running to the horizon, herds on it that number in the thousands, and something following those herds that you have no name for yet. Every large animal here has never encountered a human being. Not one of them has an instinct telling it to be afraid of you, which sounds like an advantage right up until you realise that a 1,500-pound bear with no fear of you is not going to walk away from your camp. The naivety runs both directions, and only one side of it is comforting. Then, over the next several thousand years, that entire world went quiet. The numbers are worth hearing plainly. In a 2024 review, Jens Christian Svenning and his colleagues at Aarhus University laid out the tally of 57 land animal species that weighed more than a ton, only 11 were still alive by the year 1000. Roughly half of all large mammal species on Earth disappeared over the last 120,000 years, and the losses track human arrival with unsettling precision. Australia loses its giants when people get to Australia. The Americas lose theirs when people get to the Americas. Islands lose theirs last when boats show up. The cause has been argued about for 2 centuries, and it isn't fully settled. Climate swung hard during that period too, and plenty of researchers have built serious cases for it. But the global analyses keep landing in the same place. The extinctions map onto human biogeography far better than they map onto temperature, and the pattern is strongly biased toward large body size, which climate has trouble explaining. Africa kept more of its megafauna than anywhere else, and the leading explanation for that is grim in its own way. African animals had 2 million years to learn what we were. They grew up alongside us. Everything else met us already finished. So the world you live in now, the one where a bear sighting makes the local news, is what's left over after all of that. Yellowstone is a fragment of a fragment. The largest land predator in the lower 48 is a grizzly, and grizzlies would have been a mid-tier problem in the world that existed here 20,000 years ago. This is the part that actually gets to me. We didn't win an argument with nature. We just outlived the other participants, and then we forgot they were ever in the room. The evidence is still in your body if you want to look for it. You don't like the dark. You check over your shoulder on a trail when nothing is there. A shadow crosses overhead and something in your neck moves before you decide to move it. None of that is proof of anything. Evolutionary stories about behavior are easy to invent and hard to test, and I'd rather flag that than sell you something. But 3 million years of eagles, cats, hyenas and crocodiles is a long stretch for a lineage to spend being nervous. Old wiring doesn't come out that fast. Earth stopped being terrifying about 10,000 years ago, and it didn't stop on its own. The quiet out there isn't peace, it's absence. Compress this planet's whole history into a single 24-hour day. Life shows up before dawn. The dinosaurs get about an hour of the late evening. Our entire species, all 300,000 years of it, fits into the last 6 seconds before midnight. And the stretch where we're the scariest thing walking around, where nothing above us is on the list, the only world you have ever personally lived in is the final fifth of a second.